Hello, 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 hello. Hmm? Hello, hello. Yes, yes. Okay. Okay. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Okay, well, welcome to the first episode of Summer Coffee Break, which is coming to you live from a very rainy Scottish afternoon. I'm wearing my plaid today to stay warm more than anything. It's an incredibly warm blanket. So today I am going to be working on elements of my D&D metagame and also saying a little bit about what it's all about, especially um, especially in how it fits in with my DMing. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, here we have the beginning of it all. Our world map, which is just a fantasy world map drawn up like Risk, so broken up into regions which are colorized in terms of continents. And then overlaying onto this, I've put a hex mesh which divides up the world into equal sized portions. And so, within these hexes, these hexes correlate to the Risk map in that, of course, each region has a number of hexes, and different size regions therefore have different numbers of hexes. Now, these hexes, in sort of Civ style, proportion to sort of resource units or land units in which is contained an item. Could be a wheat field or a mill. Could be a field of horses, for example. Paying attention to this, let me just go through here and take off my annotations. One second. Okay, so the purpose of this hour is really for me to think out loud more than anything else. so as I can get up to speed, and also I've got sort of like a polished kind of game concept to present here. So we've got our map, and this is accompanied by Google Sheet, and begins on this production page. So let's simplify. And have a look at what we've got here. Okay, so what we're looking at here, we are looking at an array of resources which exist classified by region, and in which each entry is fed in from the map. So, to take an example, Ashcroft. So, let's just bring up our ones from Ashcroft, and we can see here the inputs from the number of hexes. Apples 4, hops 6, right? So on our map we have our 4 apples and our 6 hops, and this data is fed into these rows, and from there we can begin our metagame. So take for example hops, beer. Looking at Ashcroft, there are 6 hexes. Let's see if we can get both of these up at the same time. 6 hexes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, good. So our hops here, beer, 6 hexes, and then we have 1 middleman. So middlemen are a pretty central concept to the metagame, because I'm constructing a kind of political player, and the politics is seen as an accumulation of middlemen. The more powerful a single person is defined by how many middlemen they have beneath them, loyal to them, and this runs contrary to another player that I'm constructing, which is the merchant, and their intention specifically over the prices of goods. So generally what happens is the number of middlemen, as it increases, the price of the commodity will also increase. So because merchants want to have prices low in certain places, I guess, and high in other places, they are going to need to reckon with the number of middlemen in each territory which exist. They cluster together, they exist in this form, so they cluster together in order to use up resources, basically. And later I'll get into institutions and how they have some wider benefit. But with our hops, we have 6 hexes of hops there, you can see, and then we have 1 middleman. This middleman lives in this mill here, and the middleman is turning our hops into refined hops. So it's taking the stuff in the fields and it's turning it into something that can go to onwards to the still. So this sort of this mill, this place here has a certain tech level, which as that goes up, everything else goes up. So we can even experiment with it here. So beer, for example, If we give it a 3 tech level, what happens? Okay, it's 167.8 here. If we go to 4, 148.97. So it gets cheaper as the surplus increases. So that's the tech level. So if we go back to what we had before, and we are, these numbers are not so important here. So we have our hops, yeah, and it's going, like I say, into refined hops. But what's happening in the middle here is creating a surplus. So the number of hexes through the configuration of technology and middlemen, bureaucracy, and paying a certain upkeep, the net derived is 8. So 8 whole loads of hops. The specific number is not important just now. Now the refined hops, oh, 1 second. Okay, so our refined hops is going to go to the still, or rather, the same mill is going to, well, make the refined hops out of the hops. So it's taking the 8 surplus hops and making refined hops through an identical process, which creates a certain surplus of refined hops. And then that goes to the still to become beer, in which a similar process, sorry, an identical process of assigning middlemen, a tech level, and retrieving an upkeep and a surplus creates beer. But now we have our commodity, our sort of final product. Or for example here, apples. Apples is the final product here. And so because of that, it's sort of, it knows to use that. But for beer, we do not need this just now. For beer, I just ironically spilt some beer. Oh, and it was frothing everywhere. Oh dear. So, yeah, you can see there on the screen that the beer is then set against a local and imperial standard there, and an index is derived. And then we have something called institutional drain. It's not so important. And then we have profit and profit to and taxes. So at this point, let me see if I can explain what is going on here. Oh. So every region has to have a standard by which all commodities are measured against. And that's quite easy to do. So what you do is, well, we need to come up with something in the region that would be an adequate currency. And so looking at Ashcroft, right, we've got silver and we've got copper. Now, it just so happens that here I have set silver as the currency. And so what happens is it's mined in the same fashion as the hops. It is mined. A certain number of hexes, middlemen, tech level, you get the upkeep and then the surplus, and then it goes to become ingots, and you get that many ingots, and then it becomes silver coins. It's minted from bullion into coins, and you get that much surplus. Now, that then becomes our index. Look, 1. So it's around that number all the other values are found. Now, institutional drain, I'll come on to later when I go over institutions. But you have your stuff there. And basically, from that, we can go back to beer and see that the index for beer versus the currency. And so I believe that makes beer quite expensive. No, I would say cheap. Very cheap. Yeah, look at that. So the important numbers here I've made quite easy to see. In here, I'll bring in our calculator. So working in, let's go to Ashcroft here. So we're using the same currency. So this, let's say we have 1. Okay, and then we're not going to Hartford, we're going to Ashcroft. Yep. And
Hey,
oh, hello. How you doing?
doing all right. I forgot that we switched the time this week to 11.
That's okay. I've just been talking to myself. How are you doing?
Uh, I am doing all right. I am excited to see more of the D&D Excel spreadsheet. So
Absolutely. So as I was just explaining, we were looking at the currencies. So one thing I didn't explain so far, which I can now do, is that the Marxist element of this, right? So the ways in which what I'm talking about here are the same concepts that Karl Marx writes about in the first section of Das Kapital, as much as I've read, because it is my summer read. And
fantastic.
what we're talking about here is how a money commodity arises. So based off of the two screens I've got shared here, we've got a region here called Ashcroft, and we were talking about the price of beer. So here on the spreadsheet, we have the price of beer versus do I have to do this? It's a negative exchange rate on this depreciation. I don't know. So anyway, we have this much. So the point is that we can derive the price of commodities in this region by making one commodity, i.e. silver, the standard by which their values are all derived. And then based on that, we can input a certain amount of money and turn it into a universal currency, which within the region we set out where we're doing the purchasing, it will do all of these sums and return the values that we're looking for, which is putting in, so we have, let's put in a larger number, so let's put in 100, so that would be silver Ashcroft coins, which have a universal spending power of 1025, but back into Ashcroft, there's a little error here, I guess, back into here. Well, you know what I can do actually, just to cut that off, is we can just do this. Can we? No, we can't. Sorry. The machine is smarter than me now at this point. We have this many Ashcroft coins, and what's giving us here is the values of all of these commodities. The values if this spending power was to sort of go into apples or whatever, and then shift them, right? Or move them so that something can be made. Hello, Luke. Glad you could make it. We are talking about the MetaGame. And so through that mechanism, you can derive the price of commodities. And
Yeah,
so,
you're
sorry.
really a couple steps away from being able to just track inflation on the market. Not that you ever have to shift that in your world, unless you have some procedural mechanism for inflating and deflating currency.
Well, let me go on to that now then.
Of course.
So if we go to the middlemen page, so what I was saying before is I've really imagined two distinct kind of players. Where do I enter social capital? Well, look, in the institutions here, you can see the ways in which capital sparses out into various different kinds of cultural capital. I don't know if that was a flex or not, but
Pretty sure that's a flex.
if we go back to middlemen, what we have here is so I've articulated two kinds of players. One is a merchant and one is a political player. So these two actors are in tension, right? And they're in tension because of the price of goods. So merchants want the price of goods to be very low so that they can buy them cheap, move them to where they're not, and then sell them for high. Whereas political players want something different. They want to have the most middlemen underneath them. And to that end, in here, right, we have a selector. We have a selector here. So we have currently the sort of continent here of Altania, and it's this sort of yellow crescent here, and you see it split into different regions and stuff. Greater Altania, Falmire, Ashcroft. So but this is one topography. This is one way of visualizing things. Which is based in middlemen. So when we look at the same region here in our pie chart, we can see here that Ashcroft has way more middlemen in the records than any of the other ones. And why is that? Well, if we go over here, we can see it enumerated. And so middlemen come from two places. They come from the ways in which commodities are produced. So we go back to our beer hops farmer in Ashcroft. He's a middleman. The guy that still is a middleman. Because they all need their cut, right? They all take upkeep. They all need paid. And they are all underneath the Lord Ashcroft, who is in charge of the place. And so you have one type of middleman which is caught up in the ways that commodities are produced, but then you have institutions. Now I said before that the more middlemen you have, the more expensive commodities become, and to a degree which you have to keep them quite lean, quite small. But institutions are a more cost-effective way of increasing the number of middlemen that a political player has. And they are represented on the map just like a hexagon. So, for example, Ashcroft here in town, right? You've got, if we just take Ashcroft. Okay, what is this? So I guess we haven't put them all in. I haven't put them all in yet, but here we have, you can see there's a monastery, there's a market, there's a bank, there's a brothel. There's a barracks, and so these are all institutions that could be put in here. We'll start with the tavern, since beer is always the central example. So we got our bar, and on this other page, I store the type of institution and what inputs they need. So basically, you need X, Y, and Z to make institution A, B, and C. And so a bar needs beer, cider, and vodka. An arena needs weapons and beer. A library needs books. And so what this does is when you put in, for example, we can add something. Let's add something to Ashcroft. Let's add our bank.
So here's a weird question, but it complicates a system like this quite a bit.
Okay.
Have you added the labor market?
Right, yeah. So the labor here is sort of assumed, and in which the upkeep, so to go back to our production, the upkeep here at every stage, this represents the requirements needed to sort of maintain these labors by which they're satisfied, after which they become commodities, and their prices are, Marx would say, sort of reflective of the labor that's gone into them. And I guess because what it boils down to is the number of hexes, plus middlemen, plus tech level. These are all, I guess, three ways in which the labor is captured, if it's captured anywhere. So the number of hexes increases the upkeep to reflect, that it would need more labor to get more, the hops out of the ground or whatever. The number of middlemen, I guess, represent a form of labor.
Right, of course.
And then the tech level, in the way that it relieves middlemen of their necessity, represents another kind of mechanization kind of line here.
It's very top down, right? You're viewing the situation from the perspective of these are the motivating forces that occur because of labor, as opposed to setting up a price for labor and then kind of working it as any other commodity.
So I've tried to represent labor before in an older version of this, because
it's probably the hardest market to model. So like I'm not saying this is like a critique. I'm just curious,
No, of course. So in this one page I had commerce, which was sort of top down, in which they have contracts for certain loads, and all of these errors are here now because this is an abandoned sheet. But this sort of has a sort of business top-down approach, and then you have the labor page here, which took entries from the names of people in this town who were labor, a worker NPC or a capitalist NPC, and then what it would do is it would allocate them jobs based on their labor sector, and the more who worked together, the higher a labor score they got. And then the idea was that I would randomly assign someone within the carpenters, say. Maybe they would team together, and then that would get a number of labor points, which would go under that individual. So if we go to the totals, the labor here right now, okay, so the leader's coalition, right, is unemployed, and the district leader is Dart Shamoon. But
so labor is commodified, or labor is objectively not commodified per se. It's conceptualized in terms of its effects, and then situated as its own community, as opposed to situated as its own marketplace that's valued in currency directly.
Well, yeah, in many ways, the labor is the thing that we are trying to capture by any other means. We're trying to describe it apathetically, right, through what it is not, through the things that we can use to sort of expose it.
It makes sense, because as a DM, to some extent, you're always taking a top-down approach. I mean, you can vary the direction that you come from to some extent, but at the end of the day, you're putting assets on the table. And that inherently is a different perspective for play than the individual who's coming in and saying, well, how much am I getting paid for this job? Or how much how much effort am I putting into this? If it's a economic themed campaign for some reason, how much am I putting into manufacturing this ale?
Right, yeah. And I think for me, the core thing that relates to DMing here is, being able to have the answers, right? And to be able to give players the answers to these questions in a way that is systematically legitimate, in a way that it's not just, I guess, a redundant point, but rather a clue to a wider network, right? That can be read or traversed, rather than just painted on, From the the DMing from the top down. This is the thing, as well as the metagame, right, is a game that players can play to degrees, in which I've sort of articulated two players: the merchant, who pays attention to prices as they go through the world in order to make money, and the political player, who is one participating in this Game of Thrones here. So the middleman again. If we have, did I make that into a whole?
It's and this is something that there's so one of the things that about the metagaming book, which I highly suggest that you read, and I can lend it to you when you get here. I have my qualms with it. I think it's imperfect, but it lays out the beginnings of a good framework. And one of my qualms with it is I find it very totalizing. And I think, like, I haven't gotten a chance to publish this, but this is going to come. This is the sentence that's going to come out in the dissertation, for sure. There is no metagame, only metagames. So there's not only the question of, like, are you, what game is the DM playing and planning and situating themselves in world building, but also is that game essentially the same as the player at the table who's not just looking at the game text, but also thinking, in some ways, I think the word would be strategically, in the kind of dystopian sense of, like, how do I situate myself within the space of world building, or is it a different calculation entirely? And it's hard to parse out,
I know what you mean. And you could say that the political player and the merchant are two kinds of metagames that make up, in which I position myself as, I guess, the role of a dungeon master is to sort of always, is to provide the legitimacy, right? To put the players in some situation by which they feel like when they are acting, it is within a world that will react to them. And to sort of strive towards the achievement of surprising players with the degree to which that is possible.
Right.
And the metagame is an attempt to, the caveat is that what we're talking about here rubs up against complexity. It's very complex when you try to build a world, and to do it systematically invites a lot of complexity when you try to become abstract. What I would say, though, is that rather than become complex, we can look to things like board games, right? To see how they handle and represent complexity, and other places as well, so that what we're talking about here is not just a very complex text that only the dungeon master knows, but rather we're talking about a metagame which generates legitimate outcomes for the world in which they are role-playing.
100%. And how do I put this in my words? It's always the struggle on these streams, is coming up with an idea and trying to, like, actually conceptualize it in a way that makes sense.
So let me say, one of the things about the political player is, for example, here, in which the regions which are owned by the actor share a currency standard which is the mean average of all of them. So prices, in effect, are standardized across the same domains, and it's between them where you have then interesting abilities to make profits, lose profits.
Right.
And so the more regions that an actor takes over, then it changes the economy, because things have to equalize in things with the new land coming into the common market.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess another thing here is the line between... So the metagame is also generative, like I said. But it's generative in ways by which, it is through the attention of the players, a kind of labor in itself that the world is developed. Because I'm not going to sit here and, like, fill in the whole world. That would take too long and be too repetitive.
Oh, yeah.
But what you need to do is a kind of playbore move where you couple the labor, which is the creation of the game, with the playing of it in a way which is legitimate, right?
Yeah, I mean, the struggle, one of the big struggles with, I think, DMing in general, and not just DMing, but, like, any form of play where there is an asymmetry, wherein one side is reacting to the inputs of another and in providing some sort of feedback. is you have to decide whether or not the paradigm you're going for is I'm going to limit the agency of the player in a way that makes it easier for me to predict the contingencies, or am I going to, specifically not do that and build a system that is designed to, capitalize on those emergencies as they're happening and react in a way that's more that's less rules bound, that's more fluid. And it seems to me that like that's a decision that it's not something people consciously usually make, but it is something that like when I'm going into a D&D campaign, I'm thinking about building something. There are some systems that I go, okay, yeah, I'm planning on them only being able to interact in these ways, and I'm going to stop them if they try to not do that. And there are some systems where I'm like, yeah, well, fuck it, they could do whatever the fuck they want with this. It's a hard balance to hit. I think when you're building economic systems, especially, you have to have it in mind because there's always the question of like, well, how.
There's always that moment, right, in a D&D campaign where you give one player just that too many coins, and your ambitions for, a verisimilitude of scarcity go completely out the window. Like I remember, they killed a vampire group, and I looked up in the rulebook because I was like, oh, just do it by the rulebook, and looked up vampire and rolled the dice, and then they got like something like 9,000 silver coins or something. And it was like, well, I just sort of said that. No, it's 20 platinum coins. That's what it was.
Holy shit, that's a lot of money.
And it's like, it's like now, oh. And so I think what's inspired my interest in it, at least, is the fact that in the social course of playing the game, I've encountered these problems that I don't have answers to. And so, these metagames spring out of, like, the political player and the merchant, probably because those are two sort of archetypes that my players have sort of evolved into at higher levels,
and like I think oh shoot, I accidentally paused the stream so I can't see what's new. Okay, here we go. How did I put this? When a lot of the things that I've come to like enjoy expanding on in 5e especially have been things that arise from my own desires for additional complexity. Like I hate, like absolutely hate, that if one wizard casts a spell and another wizard casts a spell, there's no codified reaction that can occur between those things. There aren't systematic combinations of spells that result in stronger output. I think that is just like, that seems to me to be a gross oversight. But the nice thing about that is that I can kind of play with that on a whim. If the difficulty with doing that all offhand is, of course, power scaling, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if 2 level 1 spells are cast, how do you decide how much power the output has? And that, I think, building some sort of spreadsheet or codified systems of rules can benefit, right? And but that's inherently a softer system than something like an economy.
Totally. And it's
well, I guess that depends on your conception of magic, whether it's more practical or more fluid. I tend to opt towards more fluid design in almost every instance, but you could create a really hard-coded rules for, okay, this is how these spells come together. I guess to do that, you would focus on the VSM components and try and map things out based on material cost or something like that, which commodifies spells in an interesting way.
Right, yeah, I can see that. So, for example, sort of in relation to this, say you are this apple farmer in Ashcroft, and you've got your 4 apples here. So what we can do is, I can bring this up, and we can say we're in Ashcroft, and the resource is apples, and the chain point, don't know what that means.
Perhaps it's how many chain links.
Oh no, you know what it is? It's which one of these are we at? So go with apples. Oh, and then they're both going to. Okay, so that's a wee bug. But if we do beer, it'll work. So if we do beer and we go to beer. So what we can do is we can keep everything the same. Mm-hmm. We can bring up the variable we want to change. So tech level, I said, for example, before. So keeping everything the same, if we were to increase the tech level at the still for beer in Ashcroft, then we would see the upkeep would go down and the surplus therefore would go up dramatically. Though interestingly, it would never get smaller than 3. But you can see how the effect of tech level. And so what, obviously what I'm doing here is I'm taking a complex array and presenting it in a way which is simplified for the player to see and judge by the color gradient, what it is. And we can do this with anything in the database. So if we go to Westvale, and I happen to know that they have cider in Westvale.
So you've developed not only a system for the numeric feedback but for a quick visual indicator of the same feedback. I actually really like that Excel offers you to do this. I was building spreadsheets for a class I was TAing for a couple years back, and one of the things that I find that I didn't find that. I should say all of their spreadsheets were white, and they were incredibly illegible for that.
Right, yeah.
And so people would come and complain about how they didn't know where to find information that was right in front of them, and it's incredible how much having just a visual marker of color changes.
And GIFs. Look at that. You can put GIFs right in there. So, so what else do I have to show? Well, the institutions, right, are a easier way for people like this Ashcroft guy to get lots of middlemen. Ashcroft's getting from this publisher, for example, this tavern, pumping out 6. And one of the things is, it's really up to the player how many middlemen they spread around. However, so what the middlemen do is all of these inputs that come in are required to make that particular institution. And then what happens is the number of middlemen and tech level then have an index effect upon the price of those 3. It's a bit wacko-jacko here. An effect in percent on the price of the commodity of that, commodity. So, for example, here we have beer, cider, and vodka, and we have the more middlemen that you put in you see it has a percentage effect on the price in that region. Why? Because these middlemen are clustering together in this cocktail lounge and they are draining the region dry with all of their booze shenanigans, and so the price is going to get higher and therefore the demand. And what happens then is when we go to production, over here you have institutional drain, and so when we compare beer here, right, so the index is 293, but there's a 0.82 drain on that, so the actual, that's the index now. So you can see it's been depleted. Why? Because the number of middlemen allowed in that tavern increases the number of, men who are loyal to the political actor, but at the expense of the values of these commodities. So that creates the demand, etc., because the political actor is setting these institutions. And hey, but then the question is, what happens if there is not the required commodity in the region or within the area that the actor has? Oh, Ludo Scholar saying I'll do something about this chat layout. That's fine.
I would just disable chat visually right now. It's going to be really hard to read against the background anyway.
No probs. Okay, so you don't have, for example, now come up red. There's no weapons in Heartfire. There's no incense in Somniland. But if it's not red, it's because they have access to it. So I needed to develop a system by which different regions can exchange commodities with one another, which is also a chapter in the first 100 pages of Capital. So technically I am relating this to Marx in some way. So these contracts here. So what this does is you put in the name of the region who is making the trade offer and requires resources they do not have, and that will return an exchange rate from this table here, and then it will create the universal value, which is then compared to the place. So this autofills down here with these options, So we can choose to get our cider from the places that have cider, and it'll bring up the value and the exchange rate, and then it basically exchanges them so that we can see here that in order to have 2 cider in Ashcroft, they need to give Westvale the equivalent of 8 beer. And so now then what you can have is you can, based off of these values in our institutions, we can basically make a fork between checking for the home production on whether that surplus is available, and then where it is not, checking the contract. So for here, for example, it's for cider, but I wonder if it's going to work if, for example, we can get beer here in Somnerland. So there's no beer in Somnerland. So let's see what happens. Let's do an example of a trade.
I just want to ask while you're setting this up, how much of this is like, so I know with the other systems, a lot of them are, or were originally meant to, and are originally meant to be black box for the player. They're there for you. The player doesn't really experience them in the same way, at the very least. With this system, I assume that for the player, it's all more qualitative. They make a choice, you add it to the system, that system affects the numbers that you see, but not numbers that the player sees. Is that a correct assertion of how this would be used, or is it way more data driven for the players as well?
Well, you were saying before about how you have a sort of a free flow, right? And in the qualitative thing, right, the qualitative and the quantitative is really, like Giddens would say, a dualism rather than duality, because it is about being able to have, if not a text, some other kind of array through which you can give a thick description. So you could literally do this. So I do this in my NPC generator, for example. You could say that that is a good example of where you have that dualism between qualitative and quantitative. Why? Because I have basically this sort of Rube Goldstein machine set up in order to create random but sort of apposite statements that I can just teleprompt, right, slip into. So if we need an NPC, here is one, and I can sort of scan down here and actually, whilst I'm talking, mention how frail and hideous she is, or mention her long black shaggy hair, her dishonest face, which is mud covered.
Dishonest face.
Their eyes are dull and dissatisfied and slammed shut, and I can sort of go through this and sort of weave this into my thing. But all of this is found out through, sort of random tables or quantitative methods. But the point is that it emerges through me into something which is, qualitative in a sense. And the same, and so I'm sort of shifting now into a situation where I want to be able to contrive that experience for players. So, for example, here you have like basically a complex table, right? So, but the thing to do is to have more of our prospect sheet, have these sorts of ways in which the thing about the prospect sheet is it goes one step further. Rather than showing the data as is, the prospect sheet shows the potentials, right, which players are much more interested in. I would say they're much more interested in what could be, right, than what is, but they need what is to be there so that what could be is legitimate, right?
Yes.
And so, knowing the situation is step one in any D&D session. What could happen next is the next 3 hours, because it's when the players then use that information and pivot to each other, exploring the possibilities as a vehicle for characterization or other things, exploration. And so what I mean by that is, what I mean by that is to go back to this. This is a kind of, I'd like to think my spreadsheets are pretty, but if you don't know how to read spreadsheets, it's a skill, But I'm thinking about ways in which you can take this data and much like this, which it comes out of, you know, key strings and stuff, having ways of generating shorthands, right, for the processes. So it's about setting up legitimate processes and then creating shorthands for players to use them to legitimate ends within the world at a more abstract level. So if we go back to the production here, we've got a wee calculator. And actually, you know, I've got 10 minutes left, so I want to demonstrate. Well, I'll go over actually. It's summertime. I just want to demonstrate this other one. So show it in comparison to what's it called? So I guess we go to. So what I was showing there was, yeah, this is a metagame, and if what we're interested in is how do players use it, well, the same concept, you know, is sort of explored in a more recent invention of mine, which is it. So have you ever played Yahtzee, Ren?
Once or twice.
So
I technically have a copy, but it's like definitely not one of my favorite games.
So what I've done is I've used the chassis of Yahtzee, and I built around it a way of abstracting a travel sequence.
Okay.
So the thing about traveling is that, you know, there's a tension. You don't want, if the players have set up this whole diegesis in which they are going from A to B to accomplish C, then the travel between A and B cannot be a series of finding D, E, and F to worry about, because you end up with a gaming group that spirals in terms of what they're supposed to care about. You want to refine on the journey the goal of C more than introducing D, E, and F, I would say. And so to that end, what I've created is game here for traveling, which privileges the dangers of travel in terms of moving from A to B with a kind of internalizing game based on revelation, discovery, and relationships, right, within the group. Because travel should be that. I would say, you know, this game sort of argues that the rhetoric anyway, is that travel is sort of made up of your. So let me show you how it works.
You've created a procedural travel generator, basically, but the procedure is Yahtzee, which is like hilarious.
Exactly. So what happens is at the start of every day, the party will decide how far they are walking, and so I have a very specific way of figuring this out. So say you are in Ashcroft, right? You're this apple farmer, and you want to go to the brothel in Chromite Mills to the north. So you would, let's say, we can draw a rectangle and take the width 35 and 297, the height 35 and 297, and pop them in here. Generate a latitude longitude, which then tells us, okay, it's 150 miles. It'll take 3 days if you're walking. That's pretty nuts, but okay. But all we need is the distance, so 150 miles.
That's half 3 days.
Oh wait, so maybe it should be. So if we do this, does it go up? Right, yeah. So this is the travel difficulty. Yeah. So anyway, based on blah blah blah, that's for generating the upkeep or whatever. But the principle of using the latitude and the longitude is sound to find the hypotenuse, and then the more it curves around the hypotenuse, the higher the travel difficulty. And so this guy's going however many miles, 150 miles. That means each hex is about 30 miles. And it's going to take him a couple of days, but he's excited for it. And then what we do is we can go to our character sheet here, and we can see here. So we want to go 150 miles. We'll just put that there. So this guy, let's say these are his actual scores. He's walking, and we can set the pace. So this pace is a multiplier for your constitution score, 11 in miles. So if you're going at 1 pace, that means you're going 11 miles in a day. And an average strength person can go about 22 miles in a day. So, but the pace relative to the constitution score gives us certain things. So what it does is it means that you will be spending less time exploring the area around you because you are walking at a fast pace to go more miles. Therefore, you are not looking around you or being active in other ways. So what's this target? Is that a number? Yeah. So we have the maximum here, right, at this pace. And then what this does is it generates the number of re-rolls we get in Yahtzee. Or sorry, what I call free rolls. So what that means is, so let's give this guy a decent constitution.
So what's really funny about this for me, by the way, is that I think what you've created here also gives your players this intense desire to go, I think I do want Dimension Door. It's incredible in large scale campaigns, even without a system like this, how much having multiple casts of Dimension Door changes the campaign, because suddenly it's well, I've got 3 teleports a day, I could take 5 people with me, so let's jump to this city. And then we'll jump to this city, and then we'll jump to this city. Of course,
right? That would complete, and that's having something like this as the norm, and then introducing Dimension Door would be game changing, right? But
absolutely.
So the maximum here, right? It gives us a number of free rolls that we have. So let's go about 1.5 walking. We've got -1 fatigue, which is good, and actually, I'm just gonna put in a 0 just now. So it's going to say we can walk 22.5 miles with 2 free rolls. So what does that mean? It means, well, I can roll once in Yahtzee and then have 1 reroll. And then every reroll I have after that will cost me 1 fatigue. On top of what's happening anyway. So just walking this many miles in a day is going to give me from 0 fatigue to... well, this should be 2. 1 second. This shouldn't be a negative. There we go. So a fatigue of 2 in my system basically lowers all of your scores by 2. So if I put that in, then... oh, it's based off of this one. Okay, well, if I put 2 in here, you can see that all of these scores are now this. That's bad. And when it gets to 0, you die. So you have this game which generates fatigue in exchange for miles walked, basically. And how much time you don't walk allows you to accomplish certain essential things that you need to do through this Yahtzee game. Now, we don't play a full game of Yahtzee. Every day, what we do is every member of the party can roll 1 hand at Yahtzee. So I've got 2 free rolls up here, and that means I can roll 2d6. So let's get a d6 visualizer up here. This is not what I wanted. Any dice. Okay, so is that what I wanted? No. I want it a nice visual one. Here we go. So we're gonna roll 5d6, which is Yahtzee. And what we got is 3 2s. Cool. Oh, it's not gonna let me re-roll specific ones though. Okay.
Well, I mean, what's your logic for re-rolls?
But okay. So what I'm trying to decide is, so you roll. Say you roll your array of dice. We have, of course, your scores in Yahtzee, which are described here. So you have the top and the bottom. These are poker hands. And up here, these are just however many of a certain number you have. And then you set what number you get in here. So right now, 0's bad. But, so 3 1s, you would put in a score of 3, 3 2s. And so Yahtzee is like a common parlor game. which you can find the rules for elsewhere. The way in which I modified it is that in these text ones they have themed effects for the journey. So up here you have basically things that you want to put your scores into. So based upon your fatigue, remember you're leveraging fatigue for the miles you can walk, and what you don't spend, or rather your fatigue, what you have that you don't spend, you can roll into a Yahtzee hand. And so that means that with you, basically the narrative of this, right, the thing that explains the complexity in a legitimate way is that, okay, you are walking, you're already pretty tired, you set a pace of 1.5 your normal stroll, and you're going to walk 19.5 miles today, and you've rolled, let's say, 4 threes, a 2 and a 1, right? So, 3 threes, a 2 and a 1. So that could go into your top 3 here and satisfy navigation. And what that does is it basically says you're spending your time making sure that nothing goes wrong with navigation. Or you could put, I guess, if they were 2s, you could see put it into disease, and what that means is you ensure that nobody in your party is going to get sick. And so in a way what you're doing is you're dividing up your labor, right, in a way that spreads your risk. So you're basically picking your battles, and the whole party shares it's not so much the whole party shares, but some of these have effects for the whole party. But for example, water, scoring in your sixes means that you are able to find a water source that day, and so people can fill up their containers for their water. 5 for food. Shelter means that if you don't get the adequate one for shelter means like finding a really good place to sleep at the end of a day of travel. If you don't have that, it's not the end of the world, because then you can supply your own shelter, like a tent or something, or else gain 1 fatigue. So there's options there. But basically, the ways in which you spend your points up here, either give you more or stops you from gaining certain fatigue. And so to play in a really bad way would be to ignore all of these and then take all the extra fatigue, which would only lower your constitution score, therefore setting a smaller maximum distance that you can journey, meaning that you don't accomplish your larger goal of getting anywhere. Now the bottom ones are the intrigue ones. So when you're not basically trying to survive, which I don't think will take all of the time if a group of, say, 3 adventurers share the top, then in some of your days traveling, and let me just say that at the end of every round, besides campfire and stuff, the party would move, I can sort of annotate on this, how they move forward on their trail. You have, of course, the poker hands, which narratively translate into what I've called here revelations and discoveries. So revelation are the 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, and because 4 of a kind is more difficult to get than a 3 of a kind, it is a major revelation in which I will basically shift the players into a full-on flashback to do with an item on their destiny table. The minor revelation is the same, but more, remembering a connection or something to put 2 and 2 together. I'll see you later, Luke, and hello, David. The discovery... Yeah, so I should explain quickly what the Destiny table is. Destiny table is a way in which I combine a player's quest log with a table. And what happens is as a way to sort of like build intriguing situations, I can call for, you can roll on your Destiny table, and then you'll have sort of like the main influences affect which destiny. So you roll, and maybe you've got 2 or 3 quests, and so you roll a d4, and whatever it is it aligns to, that then creates the situation. So you've got a generative thing there, right? And the same. So in the major revelation, basically the player will experience a flashback and then roll on their destiny table to find out what the flashback, dream, or vision is about. The minor revelation does the same, but in which the dungeon master will build on some intrigue based on one of your character arcs. And what this is about is it's about keeping your players affirmed quests, like the things that they've decided to be interested in. It creates an actual mechanic which keeps those central to the freeform roleplay. And then the other mechanic here, which is the discovery, is again a kind of playboard thing in which, as you move through the world, hexes either adjacent to you or further afield will change, and so I change the world as they go through. And so the movement of the players becomes a way that generatively transforms the wider world around you. And then Full House is a discover settlement, which is good because fatigue will build up and people will need to rest. And then Yahtzee, the best one, is a free choice. So in other words, you can choose anything on the table, maybe something that your party really need, or something else, especially, in terms of discoveries or other ancillary tables, yada, yada, yada. So, that Yahtzee one is more, a little less concerned with the Marx angle, but what it does is it shows a new iteration in what Ren brought up about how these meta games are designed for players to actually interact with. Are you still there, Ren?
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just taking it in. It's a neat system. I think that's the word I would use. It's neat. I do think it's interesting that with survival mechanics in D&D, I don't know how 4th edition works as far as working around these things, right? Because I know 5th edition's paradigm is simplify, 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 right? So you have a background ability for some people that allows them to do things like always find a clean source of water, right? That's just something that a character can do. And so that, adapting to 5th edition requires, to some extent, a knowledge base of like, okay, what's been simplified, what's still complex, what can I still build on, what am I ignoring, what am I changing, right? Because there are some things that just, it's not for long-term travel. I'm interested in, I guess, with a system like this, how player levels evolve in a way to make this more trivial. To go, well, we don't want to deal with disease, and disease is now a constant issue for us. So, am I the character who takes cure poison, right? Or something like that, or a cure disease sort of cleric ability. Well, am I the character suddenly now that plays ranger because I know that it's going to increase my tracking chances, and that is better when I'm trying to find food,
So I guess, yeah, so the thing about that is that in my homebrew, the scores are simultaneously the skills that people have access to, in a way that you have marked rules, right? So you have, these say more as much what the players can do as what they can't do.
Right.
And so through the highlighted array here, you can see sort of at a glance the kinds of things that this character, new player, is able to do. Now, here in the Constitution tree, because I haven't updated this since I've sort of made this travel module here, is that you're right. So people could invest in a higher Constitution or Wisdom, and in here in some of the blank spaces, I probably have now reason to put in new things. Like we could have something here such as you are like immune to, a certain penalty in this module, right? Now I know this sort of like it's an established thing in game design where you have sort of like a game made up of different mini games, right? In which this sort of game is just you moving between different screens, all of which have their own internal ways of playing them. And then you have something like, you see, 5th edition, which has sort of like these core mechanics which move through all of the game, and sort of, you know, if you know that core mechanic, you can pretty much work at any aspect of the game, right? But as a homebrew, what it allows me to do is see the kinds of concepts that are able to emerge through the sort of the use of spreadsheets and programming, I guess, in a way that doesn't alienate the players but enhances what they want to do, right? It gives them the numbers, the legitimate outcomes for their freeform role playing. And so what I anticipate with this Yahtzee thing, what I would like it to do is give us the structure for a roleplay heavy session, right? In which the players have everything they need in order to move across this journey, and as they do, they follow this sort of set procedural, and the different outcomes and things. I guess at the end of every day, there will be a sort of thing around the campfire, right? In which people will reconcile their fatigue, because I guess it's very simple, like one portion of food, one quaff of water satisfies, you know, or stops you from getting one fatigue each, right? The food and the water. And so there's the potential for you to like really get fatigued very quickly if you don't satisfy these things. But I mean, you can bring portions of food from a merchant, and then this doesn't matter. I mean, this is really just for gathering food in the wild, which is also, like you say, as people level up, could be something that they're able to do passively, and so it's not something you have to worry about. The idea being that higher level players, it's easier for them to travel alone and be comfortable, whereas lower level players, because they have to spread their weaker scores across so many things that they don't have, you know, immunity to, it makes sense for them to travel together, and if they don't, they could come into serious problems. And the thing is that, you know, when I say that, I'm not making it up. I'm speaking through the logic that the game engenders, right? And that's the important thing for... I guess that's the important thing, because what I have here is effectively a tool that I can use to tell, you know, a narrative-based session, right? In which I have all of the instructions for myself and the players to sort of what to do next, right? What will be fun. And you know, it's because travel can, you know, get out of hand, can't it? You know, you can never reach your destination, or you start off slow and then just skip, or you just skip and then, you know, you have to then think backwards in terms of what's going on, you know, or maybe you make travel just sort of like a cinematic thing where you move through different chapter like descriptions, right? But then in all of these things, it doesn't feel like it's the players who are moving. It feels like the world is moving around the players, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
Whereas the fatigue, because it affects the central scores of the players, it means that, for example, let's say they set out on a pace of like 2 for 2 days, right? And they're sort of doing all this stuff or whatever, and then they gain like a fatigue of 6, right? And then they get attacked, right? At that point, an attack has stakes, even for higher level characters. I guess because the kind of... Because if this guy had a fatigue of 6, right? He starts to have all of these other things appear, right? Which I can use as legitimate ways to cripple him. He's shy and filled with hateful feelings, compelled to fall in love with the next person that talks to you, and all of these things, you know, things start to go wrong at that point, you know. And so the thing is that between this and this, I have a legitimate way to bring any player, regardless of how long they've been playing, into a new kind of stakes-filled procedural, which is legitimate, but which could also be lethal. And that's something that I think Dungeon Masters can struggle with, as they have long-term characters which become too powerful for the kinds of worlds that they're throwing at them, you know? Whereas, I mean, here, moving between these, you have, you know, it tells you what the player, basically, the range of his agency, and then here you have the things that he has to accomplish. And so and then making choices about. So, whilst rolling the dices, you'll have to choose between shelter or, food. And then you have also the innate mechanics of Yahtzee itself, in which you have to make choices about which potential hands to go after, right? But rather than having the stakes, for example, in regular Yahtzee, of getting the bonus at the top by having at least 3 in each of these, right? At the top you get a number 63, and then you get a further 25-point bonus, right? Sort of decoupling that from the Yahtzee mechanics and putting in its place D&D mechanics, and which you can sort of store in a spreadsheet like this. And you could, my plan is that every character sheet will have this in it, like this system, so that it's sort of internal to each character, etc. It's just one of the many modular smart systems that make up this character sheet, And yeah, that's basically. I'm running this for the first time tomorrow night. And excited to see how it fucks up.
There's a good retrospective blog post right there.
Right. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So
more phenomenological blog posts, please. Bring it.
So to bring this to a close, I would say I started off today talking about MetaGame, which in which I sort of root this sort of if you next time I'll maybe read some excerpts from Marx in which it sounds exactly like what I'm talking about, where he talks about it's the same language of the game. He'll talk about commodities and exchange, and he even at one point did Gygax's exchange between gold and silver was 1 and 10 or 1 and 100. Marx's ratio between gold and silver is 1 in 15. I think it's funny to sort of equate the two, Gygax and Marx, as basically interested in the same kinds of things. But yes, so a way of building a material-based economy on this hex map with these risk regions. It sort of contrives a sense of scarcity, and then through which having this sort of calculator, which then feeds back the commodity prices, and then you can use this part at the top to sort of go between different regions and compare the currencies and the values and the sort of returns, and then the emergence of a merchant player who can use this as a metagame in order to make decisions that have abstract consequences at the same time as they have role-played consequences because they happen within the session. And then this other player, the antithesis of the merchant, which is the politician, the political player, who instead is interested in the middlemen that make up society, both in production and also in institutions, which the political player basically spends their time developing as a way to legitimately get more middlemen and therefore a bigger slice of the pie, and titles. And I didn't even go into these scores, but basically comparing each player in terms of these sorts of different kinds of cultural capital, and then the ways in which institutions are built and how they pair with the commodity inputs, and they give out these cultural capital scores, and the development of a system by which you can have regions, aka political players, have trade agreements so that they can satisfy the desires of the middlemen in their institutions, who are giving them all of this political legitimacy. And I think that's all I can bear to talk about today. Ren, do you have any closing remarks or questions?
Whole system go burr. Nah, actually, it's genuinely pretty great, and I don't think I have anything else to add.
All right, excellent. Well, in which case, this was the first coffee break of the summer, coming to you at the earlier time of 11 a.m.
Drink more coffee faster. Coffee break.
Which is probably something we should have told people. But
No,
you
no,
know,
no, 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 no. What? Why would you think that?
I know, I know. Um, good. Yeah. So I guess next time I do something, hopefully I'll have more crazy experimental wacko systems and a little bit of Marx as well. As you know, I cover more of it, and I can sort of start to put together maybe a blog post about how the two sort of intertwine. But good. Good. Okay. Well, I'm gonna go off the stream now. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Uh,